Hello and welcome. I am here to talk to you guys a little bit about database functions in Excel today. So, database functions are a really great feature in Excel when you want to aggregate data that have multiple conditions, but you don't hear it get the love of something like a VLOOKUP or an HLOOKUP or index and match or anything like that, or sum if or count if. Um, Database functions maybe aren't quite as popular, although they're very powerful because they require a little bit of setup and configuration in your worksheet that you just don't have with something as if you were going to use a sum if or sum ifs, which is IFS, in order to get things done. So let's just jump into this data that we have, and I'll show you a little bit about what makes database functions special, a little bit about how they work. And I want to stress as we get into this, these are database functions. And really, you could make a database out of anything. However, you really shouldn't be using Excel as a true database. So even though we're doing database functions today, you really should be using a dedicated database program like even something as simple as Access or SQL or something like that versus Excel. It's just not a good feature. As your data gets too big, it's going to slow down your Excel worksheet and it's going to eventually stall out and crash the program. So you don't really want to do that. Okay. So database functions and true databases, enterprise databases, are kind of separate things. You'll see why we call these database functions in a second, because they work very similar to queries that you would do in a database, but they're really two separate things. So let's just take a look at what we've got. Let's get familiar with our data for a second. So you're looking at a data set of houses, okay? And in row 17 here, you've got the address, the subdivision, the number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, lot size, what type of heat it has, age, cost, and date of moving, okay? So you've got a ton of stuff in this data set here. And if you were to add up the cost of every single house in this data set, so if I start here, I use my trusty shortcut control down arrow, it tells me, because I added this sum already, that the total value of every house in the entire data set, so if you add up all the costs, it's $3,891,500. Okay? $3,891,500. You add all these up. So now if I jump up here, and I look at the total value of all the homes in the Heathwood subdivision, well, this isn't correct as of yet, because if I look at this, and I've got a function right here, which is an actual database function, it's telling me 3,891,500. So that's not correct. That's the total value of all the homes in the neighborhood, right? Every single home. That's not what we're looking for. But if I were to jump in, and right down here, I've got this little special space here, and it wants to know Heathwood, right? So if I type in Heathwood, all of a sudden it tells me 700,000. Now, if I wanted to check this just to make sure that I've got the right value, I could use this other function just to make sure I've done this correctly. I could use SUMIF here. So if I give it the range of subdivision for SUMIF, and I give it the criteria of Heathwood, and I give it the sum range of cost, we can just check this. Oh, look at that. I get 700,000. Intriguing, right? So what if I wanted to do Windsor instead? All right, well, we'll go Windsor here. And it gives me a value of 989,500. And I'm going to make a little change here to make this easier for myself. So instead of using a reference for Heathwood here, we'll just grab this same criteria. And it gives me 989,500. How about that? Okay. So basically, this database function is giving me the ability to do the same thing that the sum if function is doing, right? A conditional aggregate of data. What makes database functions more powerful than a sum if or sum ifs, now sum ifs could do the same thing, but it requires multiple steps, is that I could add to it. So if I jump over here and say I want the Heathwood subdivision, okay, Heathwood subdivision, and I'll delete this so you don't need to see this anymore. I could say, well, I want to know the value of every home in the Heathwood subdivision that has gas heat, has more than one bathroom, and more than one bedroom. So all of a sudden, I've got 4 criterion instead of 1 criterion, and all of a sudden, boom, that database function is giving me that answer on the fly. So the value of using database functions in general, before we've gotten into them, because I haven't shown you how they work yet, is that they give you the ability to use multiple criterion as filters for your data, and they will then aggregate. Could you do this with other features in Excel? Yes, you could. You could absolutely do this with IFS, with some IFS, or average IFS, or max IFS, something of that nature. But you don't need to here, because database functions will make it a lot easier. Now, why are database functions not as popular as the SUMIF functions? Well, it's because it requires a setup. This little criteria area here that I'm using as my, we'll call that as my query space, that wouldn't be there when you're working with your data. That would be something you'd have to create. So you would have to understand how to create this little this query criteria space in order to get your database function to work. So that's what I want to show you guys today. I want to show you how database functions work. But before I showed you that, I wanted to show you what they do and why they're valuable to you. So basically, you can aggregate data based on multiple filter criteria or filter context. And the reason that we call these database functions is that this is very similar to the way you would query a database in a traditional database management program. Okay. The way you do it is slightly different if you were to use an access or an SQL or something like that, a select from statement. But the concept behind it is very, very similar. And honestly, when you get into access, the way you set up this criteria is not all that different either. So let's just jump in. I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to show you how to create a database function. Okay, easy peasy. So a couple things we've talked about with Excel. Excel can't read, but it can match. Okay, so it doesn't actually understand what the word subdivision means, but it knows that the number of bits and bytes that make that up is something, right? So if we know that we want to do an aggregate based on subdivision, we're going to need to pull the field headings of our data as criteria to allow us to select. Okay, and let me backtrack for just a second and make sure we hit this. When you work with data in general, okay, just in general, your data should be properly structured. So before you can do a database function, your data has to be structured, and it needs to have column heading. So it needs to be in tabular form. So like this, it needs to be columns. Okay, and it needs to it needs to be in column form, and it needs to make sure that each column has a formal column heading because we need those. Okay, that's how Excel is going to use the filter context. So what we want to do here is whatever criteria column or whatever column we want to use as criteria to select data to add, in this case, we're going to take those and we're going to make those criteria sections. So we'll just take these 3, and we'll take, we'll do heat, and we'll grab age. We'll take all these. Okay. So now a couple of things about these. You can take one criteria, so I could have just taken subdivision, or you can take multiple criteria, and they don't have to all be there. So notice I left lot out. It still works, even though I've got subdivision, bedroom, bath, and I skipped lot, and then I went to heat and age. So you can absolutely still do this. Okay. So first, let me show you the argument to the database function. Then I'm going to show you how to set up the criteria for the database function, and then we'll give you some nuances about how the database function works. So I'm going to jump up here, and we're just going to get to writing. So I'm going to start typing. So now the first thing about database functions is that they're actually a bundle of functions. There's more than just one. Now the good news for you is if you've done basic aggregate functions in Excel, all you got to do is put a D in front of it and it becomes a database function, right? So if let me just quickly jump in the long way and show you. So, let's do it this way. So easier to do it that way. There we go. So if I go in and I start typing D, and then I go SUM, sum. So the first database function I want to show you is DSum. So think back to when you first learned about Excel, right? You learned about basic aggregate functions. You had sum, you had min, you had max, you had count, right? You had average, and those are, I spelled average wrong, but there you go. You had average, okay? Even standard deviation and variance you can do, okay? So those are just basic mathematical calculations. You give it numbers, it'll give you an answer back, right? If you put a D in front of that, that becomes a database function, okay? Becomes a database function. So it still performs that aggregate calculation, but now it does it based on filter criterion that you create. So if I put a D in front of sum, all of a sudden it becomes a database sum, okay? So now let me just show you the arguments for database functions. And the good news with this is that there aren't very many. And if you've learned one, you've learned them all. Okay, let me say it again. There aren't very many. There's only 3 arguments for database functions. And if you've learned one argument or learned one database function, you've learned all the database functions. Okay, so DSum is a database sum, dmin, dmax, DCOUNT, dvar, which is variance, dstandard which is standard deviation, dget is the only one that's slightly unique. Okay, they all have the same number of arguments. You set them up the exact same way. They just give you a different value at the end, just like if you were using min versus max or sum versus average. Okay. So there's 3 arguments for database functions. The arguments are database, field, and criteria. Best way for me to show you these is to actually do this function instead of going boom, boom, boom through those. Okay, but the 3 arguments are database, field, and criteria. All right, so let's take a look. So I'm going to jump up here, and remember, you had to do some legwork first. So I had to go in here and create this criteria lookup space first. That's what's in row 10. Okay. So I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to go equals. I'm going to do DSum. Okay. So the first thing it asked me for is database. This can be a little confusing if you actually know a little bit about true databases. So when it says database, it's really looking for the data set or the little mini database of data that you're working with to answer this problem. So it's not calling outside of Excel. It literally wants this entire piece of data. So it's going to be A17, doop, 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 there you go, A17 through K48 for this, for this particular data, A17 through K48. All right, that's the first step. Second thing it needs to do is it says, all right, what's the field? Okay, what's the field? So the field argument inside any database function is the field heading, right? The field of the data that you want to manipulate in some way, right? So in this particular case, I'm going to jump over here where it says cost, and I'm going to select cost. And I'm going to go back and tell you something about databases in a second to make field make more sense, okay? So I'm going to select cost because that's the field heading of the data that I want to manipulate, that I want to add up. And then the last thing I need to do is criteria. So for criteria, I'm going to select not only the fields, okay, the fields that I just created, okay, in the criteria section, I'm going to go down 1 row underneath that, right? So in row 11, that's where I'm going to type the selector data that I want. So now I'm going to hit Control-Shift to enter, and it tells me 3,891,500. Well, that's because that's the total value of all my data. Why did it do that? Because in row 11, which is where I put my field values that I'm selecting, okay, I don't have anything. So how does Excel read? Left to right, top to bottom. So when it reads this, it's saying basically show me everything. But if I were to go here and I were to type in Heathwood, all of a sudden it says show me Heathwood. Reads left to right, top to bottom. Then show me all bedrooms, all bathrooms, all heat, all age. But if I were to jump in here and say greater than 1, now all of a sudden it would say, oh, that's probably everyone. Let's say greater than 4, there's probably none. There we go. Oh, there's 1. So in the Heathwood subdivision, now it's showing me the value of all the homes with greater than 4 bedrooms. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the criteria area. Let me give you a little bit of terminology that might help you out a little bit. So let's first talk about databases for a second. True databases, not Excel. So here's just a little database 101 for you. The base element of any database is a table. Tables are comprised of fields. Fields have values, and a group of related field values is a record. When you're working with database functions, okay, the field section is asking for just that. So the field section is asking for the field name, so that was cost, of the column that's got the data that you want to add up. So when you use that field value function, or excuse me, when you use that field argument, you're simply going to select the field, the individual field. So in this case, it would be J17 instead of the entire column, J17 through J48. You definitely wouldn't want to do that. So now a couple other notes about database functions before we move on here. Okay. So database functions in the criteria area or the field value area, which is really what this is. So row 11, those are the field values that you're selecting in order to filter your data, right? And think of it a lot like a Google search, right? I Google it, I put in my criteria, it tells me the answer. So first note about this is you can use comparison operators with numerical values, okay? I'll say it again. You can use comparison operators with numerical values. What are those? Greater than, less than, greater than, or equal to. Oops, not greater than or plus. Oops. Greater than or equal to. Oh man, there we go. Less than or equal to. Not equal to. You don't need to use equal to because if you just type in the number, then it defaults to equal to. But you can put all those in, right? These are all the comparison operators you can use in this section. Okay. The next thing, there is no limit to the number of criteria you can use across columns or beneath columns. So what if I wanted Heathwood and Long Lakes? I can do that. I just have to make a quick change, right? So I can add these in. So let's just look at if we wanted to do Heathwood and Long Lakes, what we would do differently. Okay. So if you wanted to have multiple criteria or multiple field values inside one of the fields for the criteria selector of a database function, so that's a big mouthful, isn't it? Multiple field values, so Heathwood and Long Lakes, inside one field descriptor, so that's the subdivision, inside a database function. Well, we can do that, okay? So first we've got to set that up. Then we're going to jump up here. We're going to go to B5, and we'll do equals DSum, okay? So DSum is basically a database sum. So it's going to add up values based on the criteria you've created inside this data. So I'm going to jump here, boom, 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 and I'm going to select my entire data set, including column headings. My next argument is field, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to jump over and I'm going to grab cost because that's the field that we want to manipulate or aggregate. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to select our criteria, which is all of this. And honestly, in this first example, we could just do this because there aren't any criteria that we're going to use for bedroom, bathroom, heat, or age. But to make this more functional, we're going to go and select them all because in a minute, I'm going to show you a few more tricks. So I'm going to close this off, and it gives me 1,257,000. So now here's where it gets interesting. What if I wanted to put some additional criteria here? So what if I wanted Heathwood subdivision with more than 2 bedrooms? When I do that, it's very important to understand that it's showing me the Heathwood subdivision with more than 2 bedrooms, and it's showing me Long Lakes with all of the bedrooms, okay? Because Excel reads left to right, top to bottom, right? Well, and Excel doesn't really read, but Excel processes left to right, top to bottom. So what it says is, show me Heathwood with more than 2 bedrooms. Then these are all empty. So then show me Heathwood with more than 2 bedrooms, any bathroom, any heat, any age. Then it's also saying, additionally, show me Long Lakes with every single criteria. So if I wanted more than 2 bathrooms for both of these, excuse me, more than 2 bedrooms for both of these, I would have to add more than 2 again. And did you see that change? So now what this is telling me is Heathwood and Long Lakes together, total value with more than 2 bedrooms for each. Okay? So now, based on this, we could do this problem right here, right? Solar or oil heat. We could absolutely do that. We're going to take these away. We'll jump over to heat, and we'll type in solar heat, and we'll type in oil. Now, notice it says oil heat here, solar or oil heat, but it's just oil, solar, or gas. Spelling does matter, so you don't want to actually type the word heat in, or this wouldn't work. So I've got solar here, I've got oil there. Now I can jump to this next problem, and we'll do another DSum. We'll select our data. We'll select our field of cost. And then we'll jump in and we'll select our criteria, which is, we'll just go heat. Do it like that. And there we go. All right. So that's just getting started, right? Most people, when they work in Excel, start off with sum. Usually the first function that everyone learns how to add. So when working with database functions, it's a good idea to start off with DSum. Why not? So from that, let's keep pushing. Let's go to average, or in this case, DAVERAGE. And let's look at what it's asking us. It's asking us for Royal Oak or Windsor subdivisions, right? Well, we could do that with the subdivision criteria. So we'll grab subdivision. We'll jump it up here. We'll go Royal Oak, and we'll go Windsor. Okay, so we've created a criteria space with Royal Oak and Windsor because that's what it's asking us for. And what we're going to do is something different. It wants to know the average home cost instead of the total value of home costs. So you know, if this was a regular function, if you were just doing basic math, that would be the average function, which, by the way, average could be expressed as mean or mu, depending on what you're doing. Okay, it's the arithmetic midpoint of a range of data. So in this case, all you got to do is put a D in front of it, and it becomes DAVERAGE, right? So we'll jump here, we'll go DAVERAGE. We're going to give it our entire database. We're going to click the field cost because that's what we want to aggregate. And we're going to give it the criteria of subdivision with Royal Oak and Windsor. And all of a sudden, we get $138,093.75. So now I want to show you something that's actually pretty interesting. So check this out. So if I spell Royal Oak wrong, so I type Royal and I left the oak out. Okay. Oh. Royal. There we go. We'll type in Royal Oak. There we go. We get 183,093.75. So let's go in and take this away. And we get 123,687.50, right? Why did we get that? It's because we spelled it wrong. Okay. But I can do something here to all of a sudden make that correct. Notice I put that asterisk in front of the word oak, and all of a sudden I got the right answer again. 138,093.75. If I type in Royal Oak, 138,093.75. But if I take away Royal, because obviously I've spelled it wrong, 123,687.50, which is the value of Windsor. Okay. By the way, if I take this out and I just have Windsor here, that's the average of all of them. So if I were to jump down here and I were to do we'll do a auto sum, and we'll change the auto sum to average. Oops, was it that average? Nope, it's still at sum. Let's go average. And I'll show you why that is. So we want to make sure we understand this. There we go. 133.32. 133.32. That's because this says show me everything, because I don't have anything there. And then this says show me Windsor. So it is showing you Windsor, but it's also showing you everything else. So basically it's like leaving the gate open. You got to have something in the criteria space or it assumes to give you everything. So now if I type oak, okay, now it's saying, well, there is no oak, but the total average of Windsor is 123,687. Okay. Now if I change this though, and I type an asterisk here, it actually gives me the correct answer as if I've typed Royal Oak and typed Windsor. And the reason that's happened is because I've entered in something called a wild card. And I want to stress that because that's in the book. Sometimes people don't read it, and it's a really cool key when you're doing things, not just with this, but a lot of things in Excel. So what does a wild card do? There's two different kind of wild cards that you'll see. One is an asterisk like this, and the other one is a question mark. The asterisk is a wild card for a word. So for example, if you knew that you wanted to live somewhere that's got lakes in the name, right? So I want to live by a lake. there's Long Lakes, there's Enchanted Lakes, there's looks like just Long Lakes and Enchanted Lakes, right? So what I could do here is, if I don't know which one of the lakes homes I want to live in, but I know I want a lake, I can do this. So I can do wildcard lakes, and it's going to tell me the value of anything that's got lakes in the name. Okay, the average value of anything that's got lakes in the name. So basically, the asterisk is a wild card, and what a wild card does is it allows anything that's got the word lakes in it to pass through. So instead of typing Royal Lake or Long Lake, it just says, hey, take any word, any value that has lakes in it. Okay, so I'm replacing the word long with a asterisk. And by putting it before and after, it's just making sure. So if lakes was at the beginning of the name, it would take that. And if lakes is at the end of the name, it would take that. Now, what if you just don't know how to spell it, right? Well, I could jump down here for Windsor. And what if I don't know how to spell Windsor? Is it S-O-R? Is it S-E-R? Well, I can take the E out and replace it with a question mark. Or it was an O, but when I replace the O with a question mark, it's now saying accept any value uh, in place of that O that was there, right? So the two wildcards that you can use with database functions are asterisk and question mark. Asterisk is for an entire word. Question mark is for a letter. Okay? Something very important to understand. Alrighty? So let's do one more. Okay? Now the first thing here that I want to point out to you is that you can't you can't use the count function with regular words, just like in Excel, right? So if I were to go to the bottom of this subdivision sheet right here, where it says subdivision, and I wanted to just do a count of all these subdivisions, how many different apartments do we have? This is going to tell me 0. It tells me 0 because you can't count words. You learned that way back on day 1, right? So if you wanted to count words, what'd you have to do? You'd have to use count A. And that tells me 31. Very good. Okay. So database functions are the same way. If you were to do DCOUNT, so put a D in front of the count function, it would allow you to do the database features of counting, but it would only work if the field has numerical values in it. If the field has alpha numerical values in it, so letters or words, you'd have to use count A. So that's the first thing I wanted to show you, right? So it wants to know the number of homes in the Royal Oak subdivision. Well, I could do that. So I'll take subdivision. I'm going to pop that in. I can type Royal Oak. No big deal. But I'm going to have to do something different because, again, let's see here. We'll do DCOUNT first, and I'll show you why it doesn't work. So there's my entire database. And the field that it wanted to know was subdivision, right? Okay. And then from there, we'll take the criteria. Oh, sorry. Did I not click subdivision? There we go. And we'll take the criteria of boom, boom. And it tells me 0. Why did it tell me 0? Because you can't count words, right? So if you were to try to do this with the count function, it would tell me 0. If you put a D in front of it, make a database function, it would tell me 0. So what am I going to do? I'm going to modify that by making it count A. And all of a sudden it tells me 8. There's 8 homes in the Royal Oak subdivision, right? Remember, count A stands for, think of it like count alpha or count anything. But really what it means is count any cell that is not null. N-U-L-L, null, right? And null is the absence of value. So any cell that is not null has something in it, and that's how that works, okay? So that's the first thing. If you're using a count function, you have to pay attention if you want to use count or count A, okay? The next thing's even trickier. Check this out. See where it says cost between 150,000 and 200,000? So it wants to know the number of homes that are between 150 and 200,000. All right, well, that's tricky. So I take cost, and I'm going to pop it in here. And if I were to be a betting man, I would guess you would want to do this. But you actually can't do that. Okay, you actually cannot do that. Because remember how Excel processes one line at a time, left to right, top to bottom? So what this is going to say is give me everything greater than or equal to 150,000. Stop. Then it's going to say and give me everything less than 200,000, less than or equal to 200,000. Stop. And you know what's going to happen? You're going to end up with everything. Because with you put those two together, that's not a between, it's doing them one by one, right? So since it's doing it one by one, that's actually going to say, well, that's everything in your entire data. So you're going to get a count of every single one of the homes in your subdivision. So that's not the way you do a between, okay? So when you're working with a database function and you want to know between two values, instead of putting cost and then having two field values underneath it, we're going to do two fields. We're going to go cost and cost right next to each other like so. And then we're going to put the between, so we have to put them on the same line. So we'll go less than or equal to $200,000. So let me say that one more time. This is for your notes, right? If you're doing a between, you need to put the field values for your criteria selector on the same line. So 150,000 is on line 1 or line 11, 200,000 is on line 11. So now I can jump in here. I can do a DCOUNT A. Nope, I can do a DCOUNT because it's new. It's numbers, right? Numbers in the cost field. So we'll do a DCOUNT. We're going to grab our entire database, including the column headings. We're going to grab our field of cost. And then we're going to grab our criteria of like so. We're going to close it off. And we have 7. All right, my friends. Dmax and Dmin are basically the same as these. They just tell you the max or the maximum or the smallest numbers in the range of numbers. And you'll see there's 4 different practice problems that you'll be able to look at as case studies. Different stuff or a different couple questions for that, and the answers are corresponded with it. So I've got a different space for that. We'll talk about it in the future. So it's a good start to database functions. I think you'll like them once you get into them. They're not horribly challenging to do. They just require a little bit of legwork. Let me quickly summarize what that legwork is. So what is a database function? A database function has the ability to perform aggregation based on criteria filters, right? You tell it specific criteria that can be based on comparison operators, and it will filter the data based on that and then aggregate based on whatever function you choose. Take most basic aggregate functions, min, max, average, count, sum, and put a D in front of it, it becomes a database function. So all of a sudden you can have that multiple criterion. It works very similar to SUMIFS, that's the IFS function, but it gives you a lot more versatility to change on the fly because you can edit those criteria filters as you go. Alrighty? So any questions, feel free to let me know, my friends. It's good talking to you. I'll see you back with pivot tables shortly.